Hi, my name is Corey, and I want to talk about the public education system in Oklahoma and how we can improve it. I was born and raised in southeast Oklahoma, and I am a product of the public education system in Oklahoma. So I do have experience there. I can look back at my own experience in the early 2000s, let's say, where I was in high school, and I can look back and realize that many of my teachers had second jobs. My algebra teacher might have been checking me out at Walmart. My economics teacher might have been bringing me my quesadillas at a local restaurant. You didn't think much of it. You just kind of think adults, more bills, blah, blah, blah. They have second jobs. Maybe it's normal. But looking back, no, being an educator is a career, and it's kind of crazy to think about that they needed a second job just to pay their bills. I also grew up on the border of Texas, which I had a lot of cousins that went to school in Texas, and I was able, as I got older, to kind of compare their experience with mine in terms of education. Their schools were always newer. They had better facilities, better equipment, more resources, bigger libraries, bigger sports complexes. Even like 10, 15 years ago when my cousins were in school, it was normal for them to be issued a laptop to take home. That way every student had access to the internet. My wife right now translates the virtual program for elementary schools in Durant, and she has to meet with students every week that don't have access to the internet because it's still kind of not the most normal thing for every student in a school district to receive a laptop with internet access here in Oklahoma. So if we look at Oklahoma, it ranks 39th in education, which is the bottom half. It's at 39 out of 50. Not great. The problem starts a little young. Only 82% of children under the age of 4 are enrolled in any sort of preschool program, which can cause a problem when you think about when students enter into pre-K. If 20% of them had access to preschools, well, maybe those kids can read three-letter words. They know their ABCs. They can count to 50. But then 80% are starting from scratch, which means that teacher is having to spend more time catching certain students up, and that's a little crazy. It creates a rough start for a lot of students as they enter into the public education system. If you look at here in Durant, probably our biggest daycare facility is the Choctaw Nation Daycare Center, which they've reported they have a waiting list of over 500 students. So another factor is there's just not enough room in existing preschools and daycares. And then speaking of other daycare facilities, a large disproportionate number of them in the state of Oklahoma are also faith-based in terms of the daycares run out of a church, which can be a deterrent for many parents who don't want any sort of religious doctrine or teaching accompanying their child's preschool curriculum, if you will. So that in of itself creates a lack of options of just legitimate, run-of-the-mill licensed preschools in Oklahoma. Another factor of quality of the public education system in Oklahoma is that teachers are still pretty underpaid. Even with a recent increase in teacher salaries in Oklahoma, they still rank towards the bottom nationwide. And so this creates a mass exodus of teachers to surrounding states. The Washington Post in 2019 stated that 30,000 teachers over the last 6 years have quit teaching in general, which due to low pay, but also feeling undervalued by the state. So if we look at that and we look at the problems there, is that teachers, they have better opportunities in the surrounding states. If you look at average salaries of teachers on a map of the United States, all the surrounding states offer better salaries and or better benefits to come teach there. Oklahoma's not that big. Many teachers are within reasonable driving distance to surrounding states, which creates a problem. I myself know educators that live here in Durant, Oklahoma, and just by driving 15 minutes down the highway, they can make $20,000 a year more than if they stayed here in Oklahoma and taught. So the logical solution for them is, well, go teach in Texas. But if you also look at it, the first people that are going to jump ship are the people that are the most qualified, the most experienced, and maybe the most educated in terms of their profession. If you've poured more money into getting a master's or a doctorate, if you've been teaching for 10 plus years and haven't seen much of a bump in pay, you're going to be the first ones to say, well, maybe Arkansas is a better place to teach. Maybe Texas is a better place to teach. So we're actually losing our most qualified and experienced teachers, and that, therefore, our quality in our education is going to go down, or it's not what it could be. But looking at Oklahoma State spending, we do have to acknowledge that they do spend almost a third of their annual budget, which is about $3 billion, and they dump it into education. However, Oklahoma doesn't necessarily, they don't adjust for inflation. So even though the dollar amount's going up, the value of that dollar is not going as far as it did maybe 10 years ago. They're also not adjusting for the fact that the past 10 years has seen a very steady increase in student populations here in Oklahoma. So if you mix more students and then, yeah, a little bit money, but that money not having as much value as it once did, we're not putting enough substantial dollars into education. So what are some of the solutions? Well, there's some solutions, some obvious, some kind of creative. The most obvious thing, I mean, this all boils down to Oklahoma needs more money. It needs more money to pour into education, right? So first of all, the oil industry has left Oklahoma. It all but doesn't exist, which was once the thriving thing of Oklahoma. Now most of its major exports are agricultural, which there's good years, there's bad years. It's kind of chaotic. You can't really control agriculture that much. Sometimes it may be very profitable. The next year may not be as much. So a more steady, consistent revenue stream could be done through tourism. Oklahoma, it is a touristy place, but nature-centric. We have state parks. We have the tribal centers. We can bring people in. But if you think about a state park and things like that, well, the state has to pour a lot of money into that, keeping it up, keeping the maintenance going, and the return on investment's pretty low. There isn't a lot of money coming in compared to the money being spent. So Oklahoma could and should and kind of does invest more in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, your more urban markets. Here, living on the border of Oklahoma and Texas, me and my wife, for a date night, are more apt to drive to Dallas. And not just because it's a little bit closer, but because there's more to do there. And the quality of things to do there is more than, let's say, Oklahoma City. It's a growing city, but it could have so much more to offer. They can invest more in museums. They can invest more in theme parks and things such as that. They could enter into more pro sport markets. The Oklahoma City Thunder, and joining the NBA has been a big thing for growing Oklahoma City, and it should look into how to attract people more into those cities like Tulsa and like Oklahoma City. Another thing is maybe the disbursement of money already in the education system. If you look at the average salary according to the Oklahoma State Department of Education, a superintendent for a school district makes pretty much, on average, triple what an educator makes. Now, I get it, they're higher up the totem pole, but when you look at that, a first grade teacher might make $40,000, but the superintendent's making $200,000. There's definitely a wide gap there. The average salary of a superintendent in Oklahoma is about $100,000 to $150,000. Some school districts going well above $200,000 a year for superintendent. So maybe the most creative thing, and let's talk about this, is higher education, right? Universities, which is education for profit. Maybe the discussion needs to be how do higher education facilities, universities, how do we take a percentage of that income, tuition, fees, things like the money generated from sports, and invest it back into the public education of the state. We could take Division I athletics, college football, college basketball, and on the D1 level. And those are multi-million-dollar empires that every state has. For example, in Oklahoma, if you take the yearly salaries of the head coach of the University of Oklahoma football team and the head coach of the Oklahoma State University football team, it's $11 million annually. On paper, these guys are educators. They work for a university. They work for a school system, yet they're the only people I know of that sign contracts that go, you owe me X $1 million over the next 5 years. Which generates the conversation that people have about should we pay college athletes in D1 schools because they generate money. Whereas I would argue we need to reframe that conversation to be, should that millions of dollars generated by a school like OU go back into the public education system of Oklahoma? Because really it's not about Heisman trophies and collegiate football titles. Really, that impacts so few people. Whereas Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma should really care about the quality of education in the state. And so maybe if OU wanted to fire Lincoln Riley tomorrow, their head football coach, they still owe him $21 million on a contract. That's ludicrous. Think about that million, and that's just one job. That's one job in a bigger empire. And so think about the amount of money that's generated in Oklahoma because of D1 athletics, and how much could go to fund preschools and incentivize through higher salaries and benefits educators in Oklahoma. We're talking about paying 2 coaches $11 million a year. That's crazy. And think about how far that money could go, especially when you're talking about a lot of the staff of these collegiate sports teams, especially the D1 level, make as much as doctors do, even from down to just the trainers. We need to talk about that pay gap and really explore that and ask ourselves, how does a school like the University of Oklahoma benefit Oklahoma's public education system? We have to invest in education in Oklahoma. I mean, it's the future. You're talking about the quality of the people that are going to grow up and benefit the state in of itself. Improving education in the state of Oklahoma is improving the state itself, right? So if we refuse to fund preschools, right, and help those help that journey come off to a better start, where kindergarten and pre-K teachers are not just having to completely start some kids from the very beginning, meanwhile trying to still pour into these students that are slightly ahead, by just evening the playing field, by investing in preschools, by saying, well, we need to, here there's not as much access, Sure, maybe Oklahoma City has more access, but even then you're talking about big waiting lists. So we have to fund from the beginning. We have to look at, how can we get the majority of 3-year-olds into preschool programs before they jump into public education. And then we also have to incentivize teachers to stay. It's crazy to think that 30,000 teachers in the last few years have either quit or jumped ship to go to another state. We have to keep them here, and we have to keep our best educators here. We want the people that have poured so much of their being and so much of their money into being good teachers to want to stay here. And so, by not doing that, we're going to continue to see a huge exodus of teachers into other states. We're going to continue to see teachers quit entirely, and we don't want to normalize teachers having to have a second job just to put food on their table, just to provide, just to pay for the education of their own children. We want to show value to that teacher by paying them a very fair wage for what they do. And so by doing that, through tourism, or to having a bigger conversation about disbursement of money within the education system, from higher education to superintendents, we can legitimately improve the public education system for Oklahoma greatly through these avenues. Again, so by improving the education in the state of Oklahoma, you would be greatly improving the state in general.